In October 2006, the CEO of the parent company of Trader Joe's, Theo Albrecht, unwittingly parked his Porsche next to a nondescript Mercedes 280 in the parking lot of his office building in Essen, Germany. When he got out of his car, however, he found himself face to face with a pair of armed kidnappers who shoved him into the back seat of the Mercedes and sped off. Only when he turned around did he realize that he wasn't alone. Tied up beside him was none other than Theo Albrecht, the 78-year-old co-founder of Aldi, one of Germany's biggest supermarket chains. And his own son had been in the car when they snatched him. But why? What did these men want with two of Germany's wealthiest businessmen? And how could they get away with such an audacious kidnapping? Before we get into it, be sure to stay tuned for more historical tales, including more stories of the weirdest kidnapping in history. So what exactly is Aldi? Well, in short, it's one of Germany's largest supermarket chains, second only to the ubiquitous Kaufland, which belongs to the Schwarz Group. The Albrecht family owned Aldi Nord, which operates in northern Germany, while Karl and Theo Albrecht's brother Rudolf owned Aldi Süd, which operates in southern Germany. But although these brothers controlled two of Germany's most successful companies, they had grown up poor. Their father ran a small grocery store in Essen, but after he died when Theo was only 14 years old, their mother took over the business and tried to keep it afloat. However, after she became sick, Theo and his older brother took over day-to-day operations and developed a new business plan. Instead of competing with larger supermarkets like Kaufland by trying to offer everything under the sun, they would focus on a much smaller range of products and sell them at rock-bottom prices. This meant lower profit margins, but it also meant higher turnover. Customers would come in more often because the prices were so low, which meant more money overall. Their new business model worked wonders, and by 1960, their chain of 30 stores was raking in over 30 million Deutschmarks per year, roughly 15 million euros. However, not everyone was happy with this meteoric rise to success. In particular, the trade unions were furious about the low wages Aldi paid its employees, so in July 1973, several thousand people in Hamburg went on strike to demand better pay and working conditions. Theo and Karl got wind of the strikes and decided that if the unions really wanted to make trouble for Aldi, then they should try to nationalize the company. After all, they thought, if the stores are doing well, then they must be making enough money to be able to afford higher wages. On July 28, 1973, several 100,000 people in Hamburg marched on the city's wholesale market and forcibly confiscated over 100 trucks full of fruit and vegetables. They then distributed the goods for free to anyone who wanted them. 2 days later, Theo and Karl responded by declaring that they would build no new stores in West Germany unless the union called off the strikes. The union refused, so no new stores were built. What the brothers hadn't counted on, though, was the level of public support for their stores. Consumers flocked to the existing Aldi stores and bought up everything they had, realizing they'd made a huge mistake. The unions called off the strikes on August 4, 1973, and Aldi was free to expand once again. By the end of the decade, there were nearly 600 Aldi stores across West Germany. However, it wasn't all good news. Although Theo had retired from day-to-day operations, both he and his brother were still very much involved in the business, and that made them targets. On October 2006, Theo was kidnapped. He was sitting in his office at the headquarters of Trader Joe's, part of the Albrecht family holding company, when his secretary came to tell him that someone was waiting for him in his usual parking spot. Thinking nothing of it, he walked out to his Porsche and drove to the underground garage. As he pulled into his parking spot, however, a white van blocked his way. Two men jumped out and told him to get into the back seat of the Mercedes, and before he knew it, he was tied up and gagged, stuffed into the back seat of the Mercedes with Theo Albrecht. The driver sped out of the garage and onto the highway, heading north towards Amsterdam. Meanwhile, the police were completely in the dark. No ransom note had been left behind, and no demands had been made. Theo's family didn't even know he'd been taken until his wife saw the news reports of the kidnapping. It quickly became clear that this was one of the most important kidnapping cases in German history, and authorities were under a lot of pressure to find the perpetrators and collect as much evidence against them as possible. To this day, it remains unclear exactly what the kidnappers were thinking when they decided to kidnap two of Germany's richest men at the same time. Some theories hold that they simply got lucky. Others say that it was no accident that two of the country's biggest businessmen were taken, and yet others think that it was specifically because of their long-standing feud over workers' rights that they were targeted. Whatever the reason, though the perpetrators were soon caught, That's because almost immediately after the kidnapping, the police managed to track down the owner of the Mercedes and the van used in the crime. It turned out to be a local car dealer who had sold the vehicles to an Albanian crime ring. When the police raided his premises, they found traces of Theo's DNA in the Mercedes, which gave them enough evidence to charge him as an accessory to the kidnapping. As for the crime ringleaders, they were arrested after a series of shootouts with the police in which 2 criminals and 1 policeman lost their lives. However, despite having the right people in custody, the police weren't able to gather much evidence against them. Even worse, because nobody had been hurt during the kidnapping, the judge ruled that it would be illegal to release any of the criminals without a trial. But the prosecution was unable to prove the suspects' guilt, and after 7 months, they were all released. But the case didn't end there. In December 2006, an author published a book detailing what he claimed were the true circumstances behind the kidnapping. According to his sources, the kidnappers had demanded €38 million for Theo's release, but when the family refused, they'd switched tactics and gone to the press. The author claimed that they'd threatened to kill Theo if the story broke, which is why the police had been kept in the dark. But eventually, after 15 months in captivity, Theo was released unharmed, and to this day nobody knows where the money went, or whether the police were ever really in the dark about the case. To be fair, this isn't the first time that members of the Albrecht family have been kidnapped. In fact, it's happened twice before. In 1993, Theo's nephew was kidnapped and held for ransom, and in 1997, another member of the family was abducted. Both times the family paid the ransom, and both times the abductees were released unharmed. But back to the 2006 kidnapping. This case was so bizarre that there were bound to be some questions left unanswered. For example, what happened to Theo Albrecht after he was released? Well, he returned home, but he was never quite the same again. He became increasingly withdrawn and spent more and more time alone. He died of natural causes in 2012. And what happened to the ringleader of the gang? Well, that depends on who you ask. The official story is that the ringleader was convicted of a string of robberies and sentenced to 10 years in prison. But according to the author who originally broke the story, the real ringleader was never caught, and it's believed that he fled to his native Albania. One thing is for sure though, this was one of the strangest kidnapping cases in history. Not only were 2 of Germany's richest businessmen kidnapped at the same time, but the whole affair was overshadowed by the booming success of Aldi at the time. The company was grossing over €70 billion per year, which made it all the more surprising that the kidnappers hadn't gotten away with more money. So what do you think happened in this strange case? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to stay tuned for more historical tales, including more stories of the weirdest kidnapping in history. Thanks for watching.